some areas I wanted to cover before I get to Kohler's model of solution-focused pastoral counseling. One of the areas I want to cover, and we've already looked at ethical issues. And now I want to look at crisis situations. There's something you're going to find a lot of pastors or ministers having to deal with, whether they choose to or not. And so therefore I just want to talk to you about crisis situation according to Gary Gulberson. One of the things that Gary Gulberson mentioned is that all pastors live squarely on a fault line. The question is not if a crisis will come, but when. Even though I can't schedule them, I can, like residents of San Francisco, learn to be prepared. So therefore, that's a very key statement there. Learn to be prepared. And primarily he's talking about here situational crisis that you cannot easily predict. More so the developmental crises that we know that you can pretty much predict in terms of the infancy, childhood, adolescence, and so forth and so on. But Gulberson mentioned here, says that the day I candidated at Glen Ellyn Bible Church following the Sunday morning service, we were having lunch at the home of the chairman of the Board of Elders. Suddenly, in the middle of the meal, the phone rang, and when our host returned, his face was pale. He quickly gave us the facts. The son of one of the church families, a college-age man who had attended church during that morning, had left the service early, gone home, and apparently taken his own life. We dropped our forks and drove together to the grieving family's home. As others gave comfort to the family, I listened and avoided treading on their grief. One of the key things he said that I listened and avoided treading on their grief. As the afternoon went on, my thoughts turned to the evening service. What I had planned to preach would now be out of place. This was a crisis not only for the immediate family, but for the whole church. After we left their home, I spent the next few hours planning how to lead that service. I chose a different sermon text, 2 Corinthians 1, and outlined a new message. Although prepared at short notice, my ministry that night, by necessity, addressed the pain and grief everyone was feeling. It was not a typical candidating Sunday. But years later, one of the church elders observed, when we came to vote on Gary's candidacy the next week, it wasn't a matter of deciding whether or not to call him as our pastor. He already was. We'd been through a crisis together, and he had already proven to be our pastor. The main point is this: crises don't come at convenient times. I certainly can't schedule them in my calendar, but they're a critical part of my calling. But they are a critical part of my calling, and all pastors must, and persons in the ministries, especially pastors ministry, must understand that crises are a critical part of your calling, as much as preaching and administration. Not only do people need care for the devastation already experienced, they need help handling the lingering effects. Crises have the potential to worsen and expand like the fires and aftershocks that follow a major earthquake. All pastors, again, live square on a fault line. The question is not if a crisis will come, but when. Even though I can't schedule them, I can, like residents of San Francisco, learn to be prepared. Separate crisis from problems. First, we must know what truly is a crisis. If we treat every problem as a crisis, we will be full-time managers, crisis managers, and that's true. Every pastor has had calls in the middle of the night from people who want immediate attention for relatively minor problems. The key is to be fully available to such people while not over-responding. Again, being available to these persons without overly responding or over-responding. If the person calling considers his situation a crisis, then I treat it as one, at least initially. I give such people my full and immediate attention. I respect the feelings and validate the pain they feel. I show I care, and I'm available like this until I can see where things stand. Again, he's saying if the person calling considers the situation a crisis, then I treat it as such, at least at the beginning. Empathy at this point is critical. I try to react not based on how I feel about others' problems, but how I would feel if I were in their place. Their mountain may be a molehill, but if they see it as a mountain, I need to help them work through those feelings and get a better perspective. Communicating such care while assessing the situation may take only 5 minutes. Then, depending on the need, I can set an appointment or make other plans to tend to them. In this way, I can manage the problem without dismissing the person's pain. And if it's an authentic crisis, I can take more immediate action. And one of the things you want to look at in terms of not dismissing that person's pain. That's something that you want to really keep in mind. Manage your own reaction. I once received a call at 3 a.m. to come and help the family of a man who had just killed himself with a shotgun. Initially, all they knew was that a shot had been fired and the man was hospitalized. It was my job to drive the wife and her 3 children to the hospital. And then, when I discovered exactly what happened, informed them that the husband father had taken his own life. In situations like this, my first challenge is to manage my own reactions. I typically face 2 kinds of crises. Those I feel confident and qualified to manage because of my experience and training, and those that intimidate me. Each has its own temptations. When I feel comfortable, I get impatient. I know the nature of the problem before the person stops talking. I know what needs to happen. I know how people tend to respond, and I know how to fix things. I want to start giving advice prematurely. When I'm intimidated by the situation, I want to do something, anything, because I'm the pastor. I feel like if I don't take control, I'll appear feckless, that's interesting, weak. Under that pressure, I usually blunder. To manage my reaction, I keep 2 things in mind. First, I won't be much good to people if their crisis become my crisis. If in a situation when I can neither touch bottom or keep my head above water, I have to remain calm. If I identify too much with people's fear, panic, and insecurity, I will be unable to minister. I want to be able to feel what they feel, to tell them those feelings are normal, but I want to keep a clear head. How? My answer is to acquire skills and training. I must have something to offer people. Burnout hits pastors and counselors who repeatedly face situations that outstrip their competence. And you want to keep that in mind. Burnout hits pastors and counselors who repeatedly face situations that outstrip their competence. When I was in seminary, I also worked as a real estate agent. One day my partner put me in an uneasy situation. A woman who had worked as a waitress with his daughter was dying of cancer. The doctor had told her she had only a few weeks to live. She didn't know Christ. He said, "You have seminary training. Would you call on her?" "Yes, I'll gladly see her," I replied. Inside, however, I felt queasy, dubious of my ability to say anything that would help her. And one of the things you want to keep in mind in terms of how Gulberson is talking about the inner feelings here, how he's really feeling inside. That's very important to be mindful of. Later, I sat in the parking lot of the hospital, marshaling my strength, thinking nothing I have done to this point has prepared me for this. I prayed and decided the one thing I could do was listen. If nothing else, I could give an attentive ear and pray with her. With that in mind, I walked into the hospital and took the elevator to her room. It didn't take much small talk to get down to her real need. I said, I don't know what you're going through, and I really want to hear. It started as ovarian cancer, she said. Then it spread throughout my lower tract. The pain is like the harshest pain a woman goes through in labor. But this one never stops. At first, I fought against taking pain medication because I wanted to be clear-minded when I visit with my 13-year-old daughter. But then the pain got to be too much. By the time we finished taking several hours later, she had prayed to receive Christ. When I walked out of the hospital, I was totally spent. I got in my car and slumped in the seat with my eyes closed. I knew the Lord had helped me minister to this woman, but I also knew I lacked the competence to handle all the issues involved in helping people in crisis. Then and there, I decided to learn all the crisis skills I could. Though I have followed through, I don't always have total control of my emotions, and at times I feel uneasy and at a loss. That's good. It keeps me depending on the Holy Spirit for effectiveness. I never enter a crisis with the idea I'm going to solve it. I use the skills I've learned, yet only as the Holy Spirit applies them to the person in need can they take hold. And again, you must find yourself, which I do many times, most of the time, depending a lot on the Holy Spirit of God to lead me and work with people who are in crisis or who are hurting. A crisis is an opportunity, and this is one thing you want to keep in mind here. In a sense, I've learned to look forward to crisis, not to the harm they cause, but to the good that God brings as a result. Number one, people grow. One night, a member, Sarah, called to tell me her 39-year-old husband was dead. While they were on vacation together, he had suffered a massive heart attack. She had no one to help her. My wife and I stepped in, and over the next few days became extremely close with her. Up until then, she had been only marginally involved in the church. As she experienced Christ's love through us and the church, she began wanting to share it with others. Now Sarah has become heavily involved, caring for others in need. Her crisis was a tragedy, but she emerged a stronger person and a more committed believer. Number two, relationships deepen. Most people never forget that the pastor was there, and they're our deepest need. Our family is now as close to Sarah as to anyone in the church. Although before her crisis, I knew her only as the red-headed woman who sat in worship in the third row. After pastors leave a congregation, the people who keep contact with them, often those whom they helped in crisis. And I have experienced a lot of persons who, after the fact, mentioned that when they were experiencing some crises, the pastors were not available at that time. And so therefore, unfortunately, they chose to go to another church, attend another church. And many times I feel that when persons that have been regular attendees or have attended the church pretty regularly and pretty much even active in your church, and all of a sudden they don't show on Sundays or whatever, you don't see them anymore, it's always good to call and find out what's going on. It's always good to call, because sometimes persons who might be experiencing crises or crisis situation might become so immobilized, so paralyzed sometimes that they might not even have the energy to even pick up the phone, to even call the pastor or the minister. So it's always good to check upon them. A sense of satisfaction fills me. Since Christ is a part of my calling, and since I have invested considerably in crisis training, I get fireman-like satisfaction from entering the burning house houses of people's lives and walking out with them on my shoulder. This isn't the Messiah complex at work, but a legitimate sense that I'm doing something significant, doing what God called me to do. I can't immediately see the fruits of other pastoral labor, but when counseling in crisis, I often see tangible results very quickly, and that can happen many times. Regular short-term or personal doing long-term counseling, which I don't recommend for pastors, you basically might not see too much in terms of what's going on in terms of your work. But in doing the crisis intervention or crisis counseling, you can see some immediate changes and get some immediate feedback. And that's interesting. There are a lot of persons who, when they've lost a loved one and the pastor has intervened and come to help with whatever arrangements might be needed and have done the services for the individual, I've found those persons to really come and start the process of committing their lives to Christ. Well, some persons have really started thinking about, I need to really get in the right relationship with Jesus Christ. It really brings some type of, and so the pastor many times can see these kinds of things happening in the lives of persons. But the thing about it is that you want to look not so much with the human eye, but you want to look with God's eye, the Spirit of the Holy Spirit working, opening your eyes to see, because sometimes persons don't pay attention to the fruits of what they have that have been produced as a result of working with people and working people through crisis situations. Handling a crisis, I may not be able to plan for a specific crisis, but I can decide ahead of time what steps I will take once a crisis presents itself. Here's what I try to do. Offer presence. In the midst of the suicide tragedy on Candidating Sunday, one woman from the congregation came to the family home and just sat on the couch with her arm around the shoulder of the grieving mother. For the entire afternoon, I don't think she said 10 words, but the mother later told me I drew more comfort from her than from anything. Presence is powerful. Pain and trauma isolate a person, particularly in medical crisis. A patient is in alien surroundings, treated by some personnel more like a problem than a person. People in pain want to withdraw like a turtle into a shell, but isolation intensifies the pain. So those in crisis first need others to be with them. Meaningful touch, as the woman above showed, helps pull crisis victim out of isolation. Sufferers can dismiss our words, but touch, the language of crisis, has innate authority. But one thing that I have noticed from my own experience, and this is what I tell persons heads up, is there's something about that minister or that pastor that enters the room and is just present there, that gives persons hope or a sense of okayness. Just the person's presence. And I've seen it happen many times, even in the process of my going into where the family has gathered after they've been informed that a loved one has died. Even my going into the room there and just sitting down with them and if saying a short prayer and just being there, I see how a sense of okayness comes over them. I remember my own pastor. When he would come around the bend, coming into the hospital room to see my wife, there was that sense of okayness there, his presence. He was not one to linger very long. He came and agreed what it might be and prayed, and the little old man took on off. But his presence was just so encouraging. And so therefore, keep in mind that your presence is very powerful, and pastors must keep that in mind. Listen attentively. One of the biggest mistakes a pastor can make is to prescribe answers and solutions in the initial stages of a crisis. At this stage, crisis victims need description, not prescription. So I let them fully describe what happened, what has happened, what they're feeling, what they're going through. Few things communicate compassion and concern more than the unheard listening. This means resisting the temptation to offer even good advice. We all know that cliches usually cause more pain than comfort. When crisis victims hear pat answers, they feel we don't understand the depth of their traumas. But even truth given prematurely can do more harm than good. Although this may be the 50th person we've counseled about grief, to the person going through the grief, it feels like a unique experience, and it is a unique experience. So telling a widow you are not the only one who has experienced this, others in our church have gotten through this, and so will you, only belittles her loss. Later the person may want to get in touch with others who have gone through the same thing, but in the beginning the person needs to simply express how this experience is like nothing else. Sometimes I don't listen well because I prejudge the situation or the person. I did this once with a couple in a marital crisis. They were not a part of the church, so I didn't know anything about them when they came to see me. But the wife, a seething volcano of anger and bitterness, made it difficult to like her from the start. She even made fun of the church, calling our worship a dog and pony show. I felt she was a lost cause, and frankly, I wanted to get rid of them gracefully. As counseling continued, however, I discovered some of the roots of her anger. She had suffered sexual abuse as a child. The more I learned, the less I wanted to write her off. Rarely a counseling situation is clear from the first session. The longer I counsel, the more I know about human nature, and ironically, the less I feel I can prejudge people. More than ever, I listen to the factors that make this person and problem unique. And again, the listening attentively is very important. And as Psalms 34 tells us, that the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry. So therefore, we need to really definitely be attentive, listening attentively to what the person is telling us. Clarify the situation. Medical crises require quick decisions about procedures to be done, organs to be donated, life support system to be used. A death forces kin into dozens of decisions about funeral arrangements, the distribution of possessions, living arrangements, financial planning, and legal matters. Unemployment requires the person to reassess retirement, education, self-identity, and where to live. Crisis victims have to make many major life-changing decisions, and usually in a compressed period of time. One such decision alone is stressful. Add many together and it's bewildering. Tack on emotional shock and it's crushing. Not surprisingly, decision-making can cause people in crisis to freeze. They desperately need someone who can objectively identify the issues, sort the priorities, and clarify values. And many times when a person is definitely in crisis as such, they're not thinking too well. Their thinking is somewhat disrupted. They're not thinking too well, and so therefore they need someone to give them some guidance in terms of things that needs to happen, in terms of helping them cope or deal with the situation. When a person in church loses a loved one, I drop everything and go to the family. And this is very important. Robertson does exactly what I've done. I drop everything and go to the family. I also accompany the family at the funeral home and inform them I want to help you understand what the funeral director is doing. We go into the casket room and I help them clarify what it means to buy a casket, that their feelings for their loved ones don't have to be expressed in a lavish casket. I help them assemble documents. And hopefully, persons, if they've had sufficient amount of time, would have already taken care of these arrangements. But many times, persons who just unexpectedly lose a loved one, many times need someone to help them in these kinds of situations here in terms of arrangements. One thing that I always do is I always ask the family how can I help you? What are your needs? And let the family give me a feel in terms of what they would like for me to help them with. I've learned a key principle about how assertive I can be in helping a family deal with doctors, funeral directors, and lawyers. If these professionals are not making sense to me, they are almost certainly not making sense to the crisis victim, who is normally too intimidated to ask many questions. So I ask on his or her behalf, and because I've gone through these things before, I can help interpret the technical language and procedures and decisions. And many times it's important to have someone do this. I know that that was a situation that had I'm glad that the family was proactive enough to really do it, because prior to the loss of their loved one, they checked at the place and at this funeral home, or they found out that they didn't even have the plot where the person was to be buried in the right place. So they had to really straighten up. The husband had to get the plot right, correct them on that. Then, on top of that, the husband was not aware of the fact that they have to have an opening closing fee in terms of the plot grave, and also the husband was not aware of the fact that they had to have a lining that cost a certain amount of money. And so, therefore, even the lining as such, they had some very interesting prices. That if a person was pretty much very in distress or very confused, they would have been taken advantage of. But it was just so good that this family, the husband with the family members, were proactive enough to check things out. And so therefore, when the time came, everything was in order. But some people do not do that, or don't have the time to do that. So therefore, they do need many times a pastor or someone that can help them through this, so it will not be taken advantage of. These aren't the only things I clarify. People need help interpreting their feelings. Is anger the fountainhead of this man's marriage problems, or is anger masking guilt over some failing? Is a broken woman at a funeral simply grieving her loss or resenting her increased responsibilities? The job of clarification and interpretation is one of our most important. Do damage control. Crisis can easily get out of control. Most people can deal with only one crisis at a time. But every crisis has the ability to spawn other emotional, financial, occupational, family, and identity crises. Victims can quickly lose hope. When a person is vulnerable, when everything is already shaky, crisis offspring can do incredible damage. Take marital arguments. One couple came to me right after the wife learned of her husband's adulterous relationship. He had been involved for 3 years with his secretary. I knew I wasn't going to save their marriage in one session, but I did need to contain the forest fire. First, I wanted to keep them from tearing each other apart. In addition, they had 3 kids. I knew she probably wanted to march home and say, "Look what your father has done." She probably wanted to call up the other woman whom she knew well and tell her off. She could have killed an inferno. She could have moved out of the house and cut herself off from everyone. Each of these could have created additional crises, and that was the last thing they needed right then. So in the first visit, we addressed the bare minimum. I needed to hear their story, trace how the adultery developed, and let her initial anger and his defensiveness blaze in a place where they couldn't incinerate each other. She needed to hear me say, "It's right for you to be angry at him." He needed to hear, "What you've done has not irreparably harmed your marriage or your life. There's still hope for you." And we tried to contain the flames to the smallest possible area. 2 years later, they are holding their own. They're still clearing away some of the charred timber, but they are making it. Show the next step. A woman called me and sobbing said, "I have to see you today." I agreed to see her immediately. Again, when you have these kinds of requests, it is very important for you to make yourself available. It's very important to make yourself available. As we finished, I agreed to see her immediately. When she came in, I learned she was suffering intolerable guilt over 2 abortions received before committing her life to Christ. In a single day, due to a conversation she'd had with a friend who didn't know her situation, it became a crippling issue. In that first meeting, I assured her of Christ's forgiveness and began to walk her through the grieving process. As we finished that session, I assured her, "Let's talk again next week." Her emotions were so tender, I knew she would require consistent support to keep her from tumbling back into debilitating guilt. People in crisis tremble before a dark future. They need light shed on the next step. They need to look forward to care and attention in the immediate future. So I always conclude my initial care with, "I'll call you tonight," or "We'll meet at my office on Tuesday at 3 o'clock. I specify what I'm going to do next. And I don't put that too far in the future. How far depends on how they have responded to my initial attention. And that's true. You want to have it where you can immediately respond, person can immediately have contact with you. That's in crisis. I don't overwhelm them with a detailed plan for solving the crisis. I tell them we're going to take this one step at a time. Most can't see much beyond the next step anyway. So take it little by little. Now, Gilbertson mentions here about recognizing the uniqueness of various crises. As much as all crises require some approach, not all crises are alike. Each type of crisis requires unique skills, attention, and focus. Death. In addition to listening and empathy, I find people are helped by knowing the stages of grief. That way their mercurial emotions aren't so baffling to them. Domestic violence. Over the years, many abused wives have called me saying they've been beaten and they're afraid it could happen again. We don't waste time scheduling an appointment for this afternoon at 3. Instead, I tell her to call police and get to a shelter where I will make contact with her. Now, that part you better be very careful with. Very, very careful with in dealing with the domestic violence situation. Gilbertson said, "I give immediate and specific direction with domestic violence because the victim has a confused, skewed understanding of her situation. Women often feel responsible. In addition, after being hit, they assume, well, this was an isolated thing. It won't happen again. Things will get better, but things usually get worse." Child abuse. The law requires I report any abuse I have witnessed or heard about. But when it comes to relaying second-hand information, I only report what I have witnessed or heard. A woman reported to me today that her child is regularly beaten by the woman's husband. Not, I know a child who's been beaten by his father. It's the legal system's job to figure out exactly what's going on. It's my legal responsibility to report what I've heard. Marriage conflict. Anger is often the biggest roadblock to progress. After letting a husband and wife vent anger at one another, I try to get them to take a step back to see a long-term solution to their crisis. Only then can we begin working constructively. Loss of job. For the unemployed, a large part of the crisis is self-identity. And listen, men. A man especially assume all the family's financial responsibility is his, and he's dropped the ball. Since society says a man is what a man does, he feels like a loser. He may even be hearing that from his wife or kids. I have 2 immediate objectives in these cases. First, I help the person feel worth outside his or her ability to provide financially. Second, I find immediate financial pressure point, a mortgage payment, a tax penalty, and help the person figure out how to deal with it. Something for you males to think about later on in terms of whether your identity is really caught up in the job you do. It leaves some area there for interesting discussion. Threatened suicide. Most people who threaten suicide feel they've lost control of everything except death. So the last thing I do is try to wrest control from them by saying, don't do it, it's wrong, think of all the people you would hurt. That just reinforces their despair. Let them take control even in the conversation. Tell me what's going on in your life. I affirm the one positive action they've just taken, calling me. It was great of you to reach out to someone. It's important for you to do that. I let them feel they've taken some control of their lives already. The calling was a good thing. Since the early days of my ministry, I have intentionally sought opportunities to help people in crisis. I volunteered as chaplain of hospitals, with the police and fire departments. I've gone out of my way to build a network of relationship outside of the church, an organization such as Rotary Club, so that people in the community with a crisis, but without a pastor, can call me. I emphasize to the congregation that despite the size of our church, I'm available in a crisis. If I bring more problems upon myself, again, Gulberson says, crises are life-defining, path-setting moments for people. If someone stands at their side representing Christ and offering compassionate help, they often will draw closer to God. And that finally is why what my ministry is about. And I just want to briefly just talk to you about that. You'll get more of a feel of crisis intervention or crisis counseling in my introduction to crisis counseling class. One thing that I want you to take a look at, again, before I get into looking at Kohler's solution-focused pastoral counseling. Again, one of the articles I want to talk about is the place and importance of pastoral care. I want to pay close attention to this by Richard M. Hardy. The place and importance of pastoral care. And this is something that is a recent article here found in Christian Counseling Today. There's some interesting things he says here. Richard M. Hardy says, in these days when counseling has gripped the popular psyche, pastoral care has been denigrated and devalued in favor of its big cousin, even by Christians. Yet this seems sad for pastoral care. Pastoral care should have been complemented rather than eclipsed by Christian counseling. With its qualifications and professionalism, there can be no doubt that pastoral care predated counseling, certainly in the form that we know at the present time. And pastoral care could prevent much that now lies on the desk of a counselor from ever getting that far. And so we have already looked in terms of pastoral care as being a broader category within which pastoral counseling was a part of. The pastoral care in terms of many duties that the pastor has in terms of caring for his flock, the administration, the visiting, sermon preparation, and so forth and so on. And so it's a broad category here. And this pastoral care, Christian counseling has to be a component such. So what is pastoral care and how does it differ from counseling? The answer has to be in one significant area. Care is to counseling what general practice is to specialization in medicine. Care is the means by which the Good Shepherd tends and cares for his sheep on a day-to-day basis. Care implies exhorting and encouraging people toward growth and maturity in the things of Christ, while warning of danger and preventing disease. One of the things I tell my pastoral care team when they prepare to visit one of God's flock is that the person visited must hear the voice of the Good Shepherd in order to have a hunger to follow him. If this definition and distinction have any merit, it suggests that rather than being the poor cousin, pastoral care is in fact the first line of defense in Christian care. For it is through the love shown by pastoral caregivers that prevention often renders cure unnecessary. This role has been increasingly important in our generation, not only in the church but to the world. We are seeing more destruction of the extended family with its systems and structures of mutual support. Gone are the days when people with a problem went to father, grandmother, aunt, or uncle for advice and support. Today, these folks are often separated by distance or by divorce. It is for this reason that I feel great sadness as I sense that general pastoral care is being elbowed aside by the professional counselor and the specialist therapist. Keep that in mind. It is being elbowed or put aside by the professional counselor and the specialist therapist. They are not equipped to deal with or meet the fundamental needs for ongoing and regular love. It is my heartfelt conviction that the role of pastoral care is intended to be the role of the whole church. It is my heartfelt conviction that the role of pastoral care is intended to be the role of the whole church. God's plan for the church was and is that it should be the vanguard of the kingdom of God, a place where kingdom values are worked out and kingdom care is clearly seen. This was Jesus' own vision of the church's work and mission. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye love one another. John 13, chapter verse 35, the King James Version. Pastoral care is seen in practice after the day of Pentecost, at the founding of the church. In the book of Acts, we see the church in its infancy described as being a community where care was key to their success. Acts 2nd chapter, verses 42 and 47. Acts 4th chapter, verses 32 and 35. It is of particular significance that every need was met to such an extent that there was no needy person among them. Acts 4:34. The world then and now is looking for this quality and caliber of care, and wherever it comes across, people will be added to the church. The first problem in the church was a problem of pastoral care. It was dealt with in a way that should be viewed as a model for care in our own day. And this is where you start reflecting on what's going on within our churches today, in this 21st century. In Acts 6 chapter, verses 1 through 7, we see a transition from general care to specialist care without the loss of the general. All were caring in conformity to Jesus' directive ministered by the direct involvement of the Holy Spirit. But a time came in the development of the church when numbers meant that some missed out on the care they so desperately needed. In response to this, apostles took on a specialist role, prayer and the preaching of the word, which for our purposes may be regarded as that taken on by the counselor, specialist ministry, or the preacher per se, pastor per se. The church was then encouraged to recognize those in the midst with the calling and gifting to organize and offer general material care. This may be seen as a role of pastoral care. Both needed expertise in their given areas, both needed spiritual directed training, but they were not in competition. In other words, understand that pastoral care, or Christian counseling, pastoral counseling, they are not in competition. For each saw the other as a complement and an aid to more effective ministry. Most counselors today would have to admit that often their time and schedules are clogged up with those who could be served best by basic pastoral care. While many people who are in need of real specialist help go unseen and unaided, my plea is for counselors and those of us involved in pastoral care to stop competing and start cooperating, that there will be no needy person among us. To that end, I offer the following model, one of many, I'm sure, in the way in which I'm seeking to make this vision a reality in my church in the United Kingdom. This, guys, is British, of course. We have established as a church both a fully trained and qualified Christian counseling team, okay, which operates adjacent to the church and under the name the Spring Counseling Service. This is a counseling service set up to meet the needs of both church and community. It regularly receives referrals from local doctors. The ministry has taken 5 years to come to fruition, for that is how long it has taken us to get the personnel trained up to ACC, Association of Christian Counselors in Great Britain standards. It is still in its infancy, but is already doing good work in dealing with specific counseling needs. Ranked alongside this team is a pastoral care team. They are not counselors and do not need that as their calling. So they are not counseling. Counselors do not see this as their calling, but they are trained as listeners and in the art of pastoral care. They have been prepared with training packages and our materials. They fall into two categories: those who are working specifically through the cell church groups of the church, and those who are more roving general focus. This team is responsible for visiting those afflicted to the church, for regularly looking to provide encouragement and support, for heading off any problems, for providing material support where appropriate, and for acting as the first line of care. The problems we have faced in setting up this system have been many and various, including lack of awareness of other churches creating such a system, a sense of pioneering something in the dark, a lack of adequate support and training for caregivers who want to hone their skills and gain some sort of national recognition and legitimacy. It's a struggle with professionalism as opposed to a commitment to uphold professional standards of both care and counseling. Now, one thing I want you to reflect on in the process of even this short article here is that of pastoral care that is happening in your church and pastoral counseling, Christian counseling in terms of your church. Reflect on whether within your church are persons really being ministered to in terms of their needs. Reflect upon whether in your church there are persons who are sitting there Sunday after Sunday experiencing a lot of distress, a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, and a loss of hope. Sitting there with many addictions, be it alcohol, drug, or what it might be. Sitting there with a lot of conflicts in terms of their marriages, conflicts within themselves. Sitting there with a sense of low self-esteem and not feeling all that great about themselves. Just sitting there. Yes, everybody is singing together, or worshiping, or what it might be together, or the choir singing and clapping, however it might go. But think about these persons as they are in this body as such. What's going on? I find, from my experiences, that a lot of people are very isolated, even in the midst of the body of believers in which they're worshiping. I find that a lot of persons are carrying some heavy burdens within them in terms of marital conflicts, their children, themselves, and don't even feel comfortable, don't even know how that they can really express this to the pastor or to somebody. They leave shaking the pastor's hand, or what it might be, however you do. I know our church, they kind of proceed out shaking hands and so forth and so on, but yet leave out unfulfilled because the pastoral care component is not in full gear. And of course, there might not be even a pastoral counseling component going on at all in terms of that church as such. Hopefully, the Lord puts upon the hearts of persons within that body of believers that we need to do more in terms of ministering to our people there are some places that people call a revolving door. Persons come to the church, and before long they will leave the church. They come looking for something, but they have not found, and so therefore they find themselves leaving the church. And so therefore it's something you need to think about. Every time I get to my church, one of the things that I do as one of the associate ministers there, I just mingle. I go and I just, whoever I see, what it might be, greet and talk with and so forth and so on. It's just that's just basically me, you know. There are persons who have, because of that, requested some time to just talk with me. Because of mine, just seeing, I go sometime, many times even with the men in terms of the choirs, what it might be. I might be there singing and lending my voice there in the choir. Of course, I have to sing very quietly because I do not want to cause any sort of discord. There are some times when the voice is not really in harmony with other voices. But of course, they do thank me for my presence as such. But it does give me a chance to get to know them, to sit beside them, to communicate with them, and if something by chance comes up, at least I'm available. One of the situations that caught me by surprise is when I was sitting with the men chorus as such, and I've been there for about over a year as such, and one of the guys looked at me and he said, "You know what, I would just like to say one thing. I admire your patience. You seem to be so patient in terms of how just who it might be." And he said that's something that I'm praying to God to give me, patience as such. Because in all honesty, sometimes when our choir folks meet, we find more egos than more Christ-centered things. And so when the musician and the director and the president start going at it, I just kind of look at him and say, "So Lord, help him, pray for him, Jesus," so forth and so on. But that was an interesting just comment that came from him in terms of that. If I had not been in the midst of the person, if I had not been around, what it might be, first of all, they might not have seen that example that I wasn't aware that I was setting, and I would not have heard that feedback. And so therefore it's telling me that it's very important, for us to be among our people and to really and come to know the heartbeat of what's going on with your people in your church. And nobody's stopping you from doing that. No one is stopping you from doing that. And many times I learn a lot about myself from the feedback that I get from the people from around. So pastoral care is very important as opposed to pastoral counseling. All those are important. They're not opposed to one another. They are supposed to complement one another as such. And it's good when a church can have someone who is responsible for the pastoral counseling part. And if not, the church can look among the people and choose some persons that they would like to develop in terms of maybe a pastoral care team. And out of that team, maybe it might be someone who can do pastoral counseling. Now, before I get to Charles Allen Kohler's solution-focused pastoral counseling, one other article I want to look at and might just start a little bit on is Incarnating Hope by Roger E. Daniels. And I want to get this information in because for future reference, I hope persons can find these articles. I know this one is from Christian Counseling Today, 1999, Volume 7, Number 2. And here, Roy G. Daniels mentioned there's nothing else like local parish ministry. It is here where I, as well as many of you, have met some of the most godly, sensitive, and gifted people in our lives. Many of these folks have both challenged and encouraged me in my spiritual journey. Their lives serving as an example of godliness. I thank God for these saintly men and women. But then there are others, the ones my wife referred to as VDPs, very draining persons. These individuals possess attitudes and exhibit behaviors that often cause problems in themselves. Their circles of concern are the congregation at large. Whether I serve as a pastor or as part of the lay leadership, it often fell to me to deal with their problems and resulting dilemmas. My frustration with these individuals led me to explain the cause for these problems with one word: sin. All that needed to be done to solve the problem was for these individuals to get right with God. This perspective changed, however, when I read Wayne Oates' book, Behind the Mask. He wrote, people who live in a recurrent or perpetual state of disorder irritate, aggravate, and frustrate us. They wear on our nerves. They enrage or depress us, or alternately do both. No amount of helping them seems to have any lasting effect. In this book, I found a writer who understood my frustration, but who also introduced me to the world of personality disorders. As a result, I came to understand that the behaviors and attitudes of some people were best explained by a point of view other than mere sinfulness. And I want you to pay close attention to this one, because when I get into Kohler, he's going to have some comments in terms of this. As I pursued clinical training, which included learning how to diagnose and create mental disorders, my sympathy for these individuals deepened, and the pendulum swung the other direction. I then began explaining the behavior of problem people in my parish exclusively by diagnostic criteria. Exclusively by diagnostic criteria. A good number of these individuals ended up in my office. These people sought my service and counseling because every one of their attempts to find hope for change on their own failed. They were demoralized and desperate. Their families and friends were hurt and confused. They needed someone to offer some word of encouragement. In the counseling setting, they shared some of the most intimate and desperate details of their lives. Many of these details were extremely problematic and very embarrassing. They were shared at great risk with the anticipation that I could help them find some relief for their hopelessness. I knew these people wanted and needed my help. As a Christian and a counselor, I sensed God's calling on my life to be a helper. But I was frustrated with my approach. There had to be some other way of helping instead of explaining the problem as either sinfulness or as mental disorders. I was trained in the discipline of theology and psychology. Was I to separate these, combine, integrate them, find a balance between the two? These are the questions here that Roger E. Daniels has posed, and so therefore, when we continue, we're going to take a look at them.